Hi everyone, and welcome to my video assignment on multimedia and e-learning. So given that this week focused on multimedia, I figured it would be a good opportunity to actually create a video for this week's assignment. So with most smartphones, computers, and tablets being enabled with a pretty decent camera, it's easy to create video content for e-learning just like this. So for the sake of time this week, I've chosen to record this fairly straightforward sort of conversational video. But I'll try and incorporate some of Meyer's multimedia principles throughout, and we're going to focus on that in this presentation. So Meyer's principles were a major focus of this week's reading, so I'm going to go over them and talk about how this information fits into my learning problem of creating online training for physicians around stigma reduction. So Meyer's principles of e-learning are based on research that was conducted to understand the conditions under which the use of multimedia enhances learning. So really the question we need to be asking ourselves as instructional designers for e-learning is not whether multimedia can enhance learning, but what makes multimedia content effective and how we can actually design content that's consistent with how the human mind processes information. So the basic premise is that there are limitations on the capacity of working memory, which can affect our ability to learn. And there are key three objectives from the perspective of cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And these are reducing extraneous processing, managing essential processing, and fostering generative processing. So reducing extraneous processing refers to basically limiting content that's not relevant to the learning objective. So a few different principles fall within this objective of reducing extraneous processing. The first is the coherence principle, which basically says that we should be limiting the inclusion of information or material that's interesting but not necessarily relevant to the main concept or learning objectives. And doing this, kind of trimming the fat, makes the key messages more easily understood. And next we have the signaling principle. So basically this states that to aid in comprehension and processing, we should be using vocal or visual cues to highlight the important information, which might look like circling information or adding some sort of emphasis with visuals or sound. There's also the redundancy principle, and this is basically stating that we should not be presenting the same information in too many ways because it can become distracting for the learner. So using visuals and audio narration, for example, is preferred over using text and audio narration to accompany your visuals. Next, we have the contiguity principles, which are basically saying that visuals and verbal or text-based descriptions should be close in time and space to the visuals that they're describing. So text needs to go near the visuals that it describes, and audio should be timed so that it actually accompanies the relevant visuals. The next overall objective is managing essential processing, which is basically the learner's ability to understand the main points of the multimedia presentation. And we do this by facilitating and directing learners to attend to the appropriate material. So the principles within managing essential processing are segmenting. So segmenting is designing content, so it's actually broken down into more manageable chunks. And this is great because learners are able to control the pacing of learning and sort of process information in one piece before moving on to the next piece. The next principle is pre-training, which basically is kind of exposing learners to content, more foundational content, before they really have to work with that material. So for example, you might present key terms to a learner in advance of a lesson to help them kind of familiarize themselves with that content. And then we have modality. So modality basically says that it's beneficial to present information about a graphic verbally rather than in text so that learners can focus on the visuals. So the actual modality of how the sort of words are presented, whether that's visual or whether that's audio, actually has an impact on processing. Now the third and final major objective with the cognitive theory of multimedia is fostering generative processing. So generative processing is basically linking concepts and information to prior knowledge and experience. And it's important through the design of multimedia content to sort of facilitate this generative processing. So one way we can do that is personalization. And the idea here is that using a conversational rather than a formal style when presenting words helps generative processing. So hopefully, I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff here, and hopefully this kind of more conversational style is making this easier to digest than if I were, reading a very formal style of text. And next we have voice. So it's important to actually use a human voice as opposed to computerized voices in our multimedia, and also for the voices to match the associated characters shown in the visuals. So this might look like, using a female voice for a female presenting character. And lastly, we have embodiment. And this principle states that if we're going to show an image and explain it, it's actually better understood if the image is being drawn while it's being described, as opposed to just explaining a complete image. So those are the Myers principles of multimedia and e-learning. And as far as my learning problem of creating engaging e-learning to teach soft skills to family physicians, I think that I'll be actually able to use multimedia in a few different ways. So one thing that came up in the discussion board around my topic of my learning problem was that the human element that often makes face-to-face training successful is easily lost when we try and move content online. So I think keeping that in mind for my work and in our course for physicians, we could pretty easily produce some inexpensive videos, maybe interviews with either clients or patients that experience stigma in the healthcare setting, or maybe with service providers and organizations where they talk about strategies they use to mitigate stigma. But I think that it could be quite easy and inexpensive and engaging for us to incorporate some kind of video content and also to kind of personalize it in that way. I also think that there's some interesting considerations around audio narration that we'll have to keep in mind. I think, I've learned this week that using a more conversational style can enhance and ease comprehension. But at the same time, our audience of family physicians, we need to sound credible, and I think sometimes a more formal style is maybe expected or preferred. So it'll be kind of interesting and challenging to balance both, ease of comprehension and also coming across as credible to this audience of learners. So that's all I have for this week. Thanks a lot for listening.